If you look at the spec sheet for the latest and greatest MacBook Pro 16, it looks like there has been a ton of updates to that machine. New processors, new displays, new keyboard, new almost everything. But the real question is, should you buy one? Let's find out. What's up, everyone? I'm the Everyday Dad, and if I can figure it out, you can figure it out. No kidding, I'm very excited for both my MacBook Pro 14 and 16 models to get in here this week. Last week, we talked about why I think the MacBook Pro 14 will be the one that fits into what I personally want from the newest MacBooks, but honestly, the 16 really seems to be the pinnacle of power laptop for all of those folks that want the most powerful thing that they can carry around in an overly large briefcase. Today, let's go through what's been updated since the last model of the MacBook Pro 16 came out, and if the newest version is really worth spending more to either upgrade from an older MacBook Pro 16, or if you should, just straight up jump into the MacBook ecosystem and buy your very first one. Let's start off today by going over the specs and ordering information if maybe you're not a crazy person like me and you don't constantly spend time on the Apple website reading and rereading specs. I'm not saying I do this either, but I'm not saying it either. The brand new MacBook Pro 16 comes in a ton of different flavors. At the base model, you'll get the brand new 10-core M1 Pro processor, a 16-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of unified memory, a 512 gigabyte solid state drive, and a pretty beefy 140 watt power adapter. And you will get all of that for the same price you could have gotten the base model Intel MacBook Pro 16 for $24.99. Much like the MacBook Pro 14, there is a ton of customization here, so we're not going to go through everything today, but you could take this all the way to the top of the charts of the 10-core M1 Max processor, 32-core GPU, 64 gigabytes of unified memory, and an 8 terabyte solid state drive, and I guess they would throw in a partridge in a pear tree, and you will get that all for the grand total of $6,099. And we here in the business, we call that an oof amount of money. In fairness though, I do believe this is a couple $100 less than the top of the line spec'd out Intel version of the MacBook Pro 16, so good for them for saving us some money. And yes, that word some is doing an awful lot of work in that sentence. Alright, so let's break down all of the new stuff and see how it compares to all of the old stuff. I'm kind of a fan of ports, so let's start off with the physical construction of the new computer. All of the new MacBook Pros come with a totally redesigned body. And for me, this is probably the key reason to buy one of the new computers. Whereas on the older MacBook Pro 16, you get 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports. Here, you get so much more. You'll get 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, an HDMI 2.0 port, an SD card slot, and the return of Apple's MagSafe. A lot of folks didn't like MagSafe. I love MagSafe because I'm always tripping over cables. I think this is basically the perfect amount of I/O that you could ask for in a laptop. Yes, I wouldn't say no to a USB-A slot and maybe an Ethernet port if I was being greedy. Either way, you can do a ton with this, and you can say goodbye to the majority of your dongles and adapters with that new 16-inch. As a professional office worker that has to go around giving presentations and sometimes need to plug in my computer to ancient office TVs or monitors, having HDMI built right in, that's the ticket. Yes, I know people think I'm crazy for saying that an HDMI port means that much to me, but when you are professionally embarrassed because you forgot your adapter and you have to ask everybody to scrunch around your little laptop, well then it'll become really important to you too. Another big and welcome addition, or subtraction, I guess, depending on your point of view, is that the touch bar has been totally replaced with a row of physical keys. I've never been the biggest fan of that touch bar. I rarely used it. I had problems with previous versions glitching out on me. I just prefer having real keys. So yeah, having a small finicky screen on my laptop, I don't miss that. I know some folks liked it, and for you, I'm sorry, but sometimes you gotta crack a few eggs to make a good keyboard. That is not how that saying goes. Plus, there is a new finish to the MacBook Pro keyboard that takes the Mac from having a fully shiny metal aluminum look to having a matte black section where the keyboard lives. And dang, I gotta tell ya, looks very nice. Functionally, it adds nothing. But I love how this looks, and if Apple is lacking in one key space on their older MacBooks, it's that they look all pretty dated and boring. Anything that you can do to spice this up, that's a plus in my book. The other major update to the physical design is the display. Fam, let me tell you about this display. Holy cow. In essence, this display is basically a miniature version of the very expensive Pro XDR display that Apple sells, but even better. It's got smaller bezels, brighter colors, it's got 10,000 mini LEDs, a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio, and a billion colors. This display is going to be out of this world, and I say that because I've seen all of Apple's previous displays. They look incredible. I'm mostly excited about the 1,000 nits of brightness, and one thing I want to point out here, a lot of folks have been commenting on these videos that the 1,000 nits is for HDR only, and that's not true. The MacBook Pros will be able to go to 1,000 nits of sustained brightness and can boost past that to 1,600 nits for HDR content. This is going to be a display that you'll be able to see practically wherever you are. And this will now have ProMotion built into it, and this is where I got that but even better part earlier. The display will be able to move between 24 Hz and 120 Hz depending on what's happening on the screen at a time. If you are gaming or, I don't know, hyper aggressively scrolling on a website, that refresh rate will bump up. And if you are staring at the screen with writer's block, not knowing what to type next for your MacBook Pro 16 script, awkward, that didn't happen, it will lower to 24 Hz to save battery life if able. Now, Apple's not the first company to implement fast refresh rate panels, but I love ProMotion and how it ties in with all the other things Apple does on these computers to make them as good as possible, while being able to sustain that power and coolness as long as possible. When I say coolness, I don't mean physical coolness, I just mean look how cool it is. And attached to that awesome display is the most controversial part of the whole laptop, the dreaded notch. Oh, goodness. I hope YouTube doesn't censor me for using such foul language in a video. I couldn't say it without laughing. Yes, in an effort to answer two engineering problems at once, those being, how can we get the best camera possible on a laptop, and how can we shrink our screen bezels as much as we physically can? To answer those questions, Apple removed the bezel from everywhere except the top. And that's an important distinction to make. They didn't add a notch. They removed the bezel from the rest of the screen except where they needed to house the camera, light, true tone sensor, etc. That's not just a little pinhole camera they got in here. They got a whole system built into the top of the computer. So you will still get more screen real estate here than on previous Macs, but answering engineering questions is not as spicy of a take for social media clicks. Do I love it? Not really. But would I gladly take it to get that much needed upgraded camera that will be included with the MacBook Pro 16? Yes, absolutely. Laptop webcams are not nice to haves anymore. They are purchase deciders. And just upscaling the resolution does not give you better quality. So they added a physically larger sensor to the mix while also increasing the resolution. And I cannot wait to see how good this looks. Okay, I think we've talked about everything outside the computer, but what are the insides compared to that last generation of the MacBook Pro 16? Well, those previous versions had the Intel Core i7 and i9 processors, which were either 6 or 8 core variants, and if you remember, they had Apple's T2 security chip, which yes, did mostly security stuff, but it also helped out on things like video encoding and decoding. These laptops are crazy powerful, and they really set Apple back on track to making computers that people really wanted to buy again. Here though, you'll get all Apple all the time, and I think it goes without saying that the new M1 Pro and M1 Max processors will be vastly more powerful than the 9th generation Intel versions they are replacing. I don't have numbers to show right now, but even my M1 MacBook Air outperforms my older MacBook Pro 16, so yeah, I don't think it's a stretch to say that these will be far more powerful. You'll get more processor cores at 10, and while it doesn't have a dedicated graphics card, the 32-core GPU should wipe the floor with the AMD option that you used to find in the 16. There is though one place that older MacBooks will continue to be the most successful, and that's if you need a Mac that also runs Windows. Intel-based Macs are the only ones that natively support Apple Boot Camp, which allows for both operating systems to run on the same machine. And it's important to note that the Intel Macs are the only ones running on an x86 architecture version of macOS. Yes, you could use something like Parallels that will run a virtual machine version of Windows on the M1 computers, but if you were looking for the most stable environment, you're really going to have to stick to Windows ARM, and that might not be what you really need. This absolutely applies to a smaller number of people, but I did want to bring it up here because I do know a lot of developers that are going to have to stick with this. And this might be a reason to buy a Mac Pro if you need a very powerful machine that can run both Windows and macOS at the same time. In almost every other power situation though, yes, any of those processor options on the M1 16-inch version will reign supreme. And it's really because this chassis, or at least the previous version of this chassis, was so able to easily handle those very big and beefy Intel Core i9 processors that I have zero concerns about the hypothetical thermal performance of this computer. Now, I'm not yet sold on the MacBook Pro 14, but Apple Silicon runs cooler and more efficiently than Intel Silicon, and if this bigger body can keep those Core i9 processors within thermal limits, I have no worries that they'll be able to do the same with the M1 processors. The last major upgrade I want to talk about is battery life. The M1 Pro MacBook Pro 16 is slated to have one of the best battery lives on any MacBook ever, and that's a pretty darn bold claim if you ask me. My M1 MacBook Pro 13 essentially never runs out of power. It just goes and goes and goes, and I only really need to charge mine every other day or so. That machine is rated to 20 hours of life, and the new MacBook Pro 16 and all of the power and all of the cool things we've talked about in this video is clocking in at 21. I don't have words for how excited I am to get my hands on this sort of sustained battery life. You get all of that longevity even with the new display, the new processor, the new GPU. Like, how crazy efficient have they been able to get to make all of this possible? I don't know, but it certainly sounds like magic to me. And another key Apple benefit as the cherry on top, you'll get the full power, GPU, display, even when running on battery life. This thing is going to be a walking, talking, well, it can't actually walk or talk, but it'll be a titan in both name and size together. But at the end of the day, so what, right? Do I recommend that you get in a pre-order, or do I recommend that you go to the store and buy one of these machines? If you are a user of the 2019 MacBook Pro 16, I think this is a pretty easy sell for upgrading. You get more ports, more power, more display, more everything, and the computer does not cost more than the version you bought, and I think that's really saying something positive for Apple. If you are a professional office worker and you don't need all of that phenomenal cosmic power, then I'd probably stick with the 14-inch MacBook Pro. You'll get most of the same benefits without needing to spend so much money on power that you might not need. That's the one that I am most excited for. If you already have an M1 Mac and are fine with the performance you currently have, then no, I wouldn't recommend upgrading or buying this Mac. If what you have works, keep using it. I don't see a reason to buy something that doesn't do anything additional for you. Don't fall for FOMO. Your computer will keep working even after the new ones come out. And if you don't own a Mac and you are looking to get your first one, if you need the most power, get the most sized MacBook Pro 16. I'm super excited to check this out and see if the reality really lives up to the hype. And if you like this video and you are still on the fence about which of the new MacBook Pros to get, here's a link to my video explaining why I'm most excited for the smaller version of this beast, and you can find it by clicking right here. Click, 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 click. Thanks for watching.